Thanks, Eugene. Welcome. So this is our 5th lecture in the Machine in the Garden lecture series. It's an extraordinary pleasure to have George Gassert back to the University of Oregon. He worked with a class down in Eugene called the Haptic Eye Edition Studio, which actually published in hand press. I do need Liz, come and hold this up. Could you just open this up? Liz was one of the students. Oh, and Allison as well. Allison did the type design, who worked on this chapter. It's a chapter called Darwin's Sublime. So this is the hand-printed, student-designed, student artwork version of a chapter of a forthcoming book called In a Green Light. Oh, and the title's changed. George, you're going to have to help me with In a Green Light, and it's going to be released, I believe, early next year or mid next year by MIT Press. So we're excited about that forthcoming book. George is a remarkable artist. He's been working with art and genetics since 1985, having kind of dramatically given up his earlier, more traditional art form. He's an artist who I first encountered in a show called Paradise Now, and it was I had one of those epiphany moments looking down at a very small image of an iris, about how long, like a lot of the work in the show was dealing with all of the issues of cloning and all the things we think about in terms of biotech. And George's work really put me back on my heels, because the point is that we've been modifying the genome for centuries. And it was, again, a kind of remarkable moment for me. And George has been critical in that dialogue within the art world in terms of really thinking about the types of effects that we're having and the way our relationship to the natural world in an ongoing fashion rather than a new tech-savvy fashion. So it's an extraordinary pleasure to introduce George Gassert.
So, can you hear me? Okay. I'm going to stand here so that there's enough light for me to keep my notes visible. The topic is ornamental plants in the 21st century. What kind of ornamental plants will the 21st century bring? Is the question. I think we can safely predict that there will be 3 main sources of new ornamental plants. 2 of these will be traditional sources. The first source will be new ornamentals brought into cultivation from the wild. People have been doing this for thousands of years, and that's going to continue to happen. The second source of new ornamentals will be plants bred in cultivation. People have been doing this for hundreds of years. The third source, the new, or I should say relatively new source of garden plants will be genetically engineered plants. So let's begin with genetic engineering. For several decades, we've all heard warnings and predictions about this technology. I'll give you a few examples. The art commentator and media philosopher Willem Flusser envisioned photosynthetic horses and color-coordinated ecosystems once artists begin to use the new medium. That's a kind of utopian view. Military planners have long entertained dreams of developing race-specific biological weapons. Steve Kurtz, who is a bioartist who came into the limelight when he was falsely accused of engaging in bioterrorism, foresees elimination of the genetic commons and a new kind of colonialism that will operate on the molecular level. In other words, somebody else will own parts of your body. Jun Takeda, who's a Japanese bioartist living in Paris, is working on creating luminescent moss gardens. So the focus has largely been, except for Jun Takeda, and to some extent Willem Flusser, on what genetic engineering will do to human beings. For our species, the near-range biotechnological future seems likely to be pretty much market-driven. In the book Remaking Eden by Lee Silver, who's a professor of evolutionary biology at Princeton, he tells how he thinks that neoliberalism will drive human evolution. It will begin with germ-line engineering to eliminate hereditary diseases. Who could object to that? The next step will be genetic enhancements demanded by parents-to-be. Most parents want only the best for their children. According to Silver, the best includes high intelligence, good looks, resistance to HIV, and improved odds in athletics and business. So keeping up with the Joneses will extend to DNA sequences. Of course, only parents with enough money will be able to have genetically engineered children. Silver predicts that the genetically enriched, as he calls them, no pun intended, I assume, will come to rule the planet with everyone else, naturals, he calls the losers, relegated to low-paid labor and service jobs. By the 26th century, Homo sapiens will have split into 4 species, which will give rise to multitudes more, many adapted to life in space or on other planets. This is not a science fiction writer. This is a scientist at Princeton writing about this. Visions like Silver's are amazing cocktails of great hopes and what we might guess are very deadly poisons. In stark contrast, present-day realities can seem pretty mundane, at least with respect to ornamental plants. Existing applications in commercial ornamental horticulture are striking not for unprecedented beauty or weirdness, or for intimations of great good or evil, but for being uncontroversial and without even much aesthetic originality. So, first slide. In the mid-1980s, maybe it's going backwards. I'm old tech. Well, I'll go ahead and... There it is. In the mid-1980s, scientists at the Max Planck Institute in Cologne transferred a gene from corn into a petunia to produce a plant with pale red flowers. The original flower is the white one on the left, and the one with pale red flowers is the genetically engineered petunia. This is the first genetically engineered plant, genetically engineered for aesthetic purposes. These red petunias did not have the slight blue or violet component always previously found in petunias. The so-called, they're called brick red petunias, do not look strikingly different from existing ones, but demonstrated that genetic engineering could change flower color. At first, the brick red petunias were not considered attractive enough to have commercial potential, but research indicated that by bringing brick red petunias into traditional breeding programs, new shades might be added to the petunia palette. So you can, the second one. Every new technological development seems to reawaken dreams of paradise. It's an old cultural reflex that we have. The 1980s and 1990s were the decades of biotechnological euphoria. In the late 1980s, Calgene Pacific, an Australian affiliate of a California-based biotechnology firm, launched a project to genetically engineer blue roses, chrysanthemums, gerberas, and carnations. These were key plants in the world cut flower trade, which then amounted to more than $1 billion annually. This is a image from their advertising brochure in 1989. None of these plants had true blue flowers. in spite of extensive breeding by traditional means. Calgene's project was the first major commercial application of genetic engineering for aesthetic purposes. Genetic engineering at that time promised to deliver such amazing miracles that the color blue must have seemed a minor thing, like making millions of dollars before breakfast. But blue proved elusive. The pigment responsible for blue in flowers is delphinidin, which roses entirely lack. The first breakthrough came in 1991, when the gene for delphinidin in petunias was isolated. The petunia gene was transferred into rose cells, which were then grown into callus tissue and then into plants. When they bloomed, the flowers were disappointingly ordinary in color. The problem was that cell acidity can inhibit the expression of blue, and rose petal cells are rather acidic, so gene transfer alone was not enough to produce blue or even purple flowers. You can turn off the machine. Eventually, genes from a pansy were introduced into a mauve-colored rose called Cardinal Richelieu, and the resulting flower was dark burgundy. Further manipulations yielded mauve flowers. Publicity photographs of this flower show long-stemmed, double, high-budded roses that are more purplish than traditionally bred so-called blue varieties such as Blue Moon or Charles de Gaulle. But from the evidence of photographs, these mauve transgenic roses are far from blue. I got messed up with my slides, so this is all I have. A picture in this book. You probably can't see anything except the color. And the color's not blue. The cells in carnation petals are somewhat less acidic than rose cells, so approaches to blue, although not spectrum blue, proved less difficult. In 1996, Florigene moondust, a mauve carnation, became the first transgenic flower to be put on sale anywhere in the world. Florigene moonshadow, I love these names, a rich purple, was released a year later. Today, genetically engineered lilac, mauve, and purple carnations from Calgene's original program dominate sectors of the international cut flower trade. Reportedly, well over $25 million has been spent on the Blue Rose project, but a true blue rose still does not exist. The project has involved scientific research, intricate biotechnological maneuvers, and impressive international legal and financial expertise, but not aesthetic originality. Desirable as a blue rose may be, the idea of such a rose is very old, unlike, say, the idea of a luminescent rose, a rose that changed color in response to radio waves, or a rose that rippled with color like an octopus, concepts that emerged only with genetic engineering. And this brings up the importance of history to understanding exactly why ornamental plants look and function in our gardens as they do. For almost 200 years, hybridizers have tried to breed blue roses, and long before that, they were sought by other means, such as by watering rose bushes with indigo. Centuries of failed attempts transformed the blue rose into a symbol of the unattainable. In 1891, Kipling published a poem about love, doomed because of a woman's insistence upon being given a blue rose. This is the poem called Blue Roses. Roses red and roses white plucked I for my love's delight. She would none of my posies, bade me gather her blue roses. Half the world I wandered through, seeking where such flowers grew. Half the world, onto my quest, answered me with laugh and jest. Home I came at wintertide, but my silly love had died, seeking with her latest breath roses from the arms of death. It may be beyond the grave she shall find what she would have. Mine was but an idle quest, roses white and red are best. Kipling may yet be proved wrong about roses. Today, in spite of technical difficulties, there is little reason to doubt that through genetic engineering, a blue rose can eventually be created. It is only a matter of persistence, ingenuity, and lots of money. But considerable time is likely to pass before backyard hybridizers borrow pollen from blue roses to breed new kinds of garden roses. Patent law has already criminalized that kind of creative activity. The genetic commons is rapidly shrinking. So the next slide. Bearded irises come in every color except true red. Almost since iris breeding began in the first half of the 19th century, the grail has been a fire engine red iris. A large number of the so-called red irises have been created. This is an example of an existing so-called red iris. But these are more accurately described as earth-toned or in some cases as wine-colored. Most of these colors, the reddish colors, do not result from red pigments, but from combinations of purple and yellow. However, iris cells contain lycopene, a pigment that in sufficient concentration gives tomatoes their orange-red color. In iris petals, lycopene is diluted and produces pink flowers. You've probably all seen a few pink irises. Some varieties of irises have beards that contain sufficiently concentrated lycopene to appear raspberry red or coral. So breeding for red irises has seemed less impossible than breeding for blue roses. However, after more than a century of failed efforts, the chances of creating a true red iris by traditional means appear to be extremely poor or non-existent. In 1991, Richard Ernst of Cooley's Gardens in Silverton, Oregon, mentioned to his doctor the difficulty of breeding a red iris. Dr. Pettit told Ernst that the technology to create a red iris through genetic engineering existed, the zeitgeist of 1991. Ernst contacted Tony Chen, a professor at Oregon State University, and together they initiated a project to genetically engineer a red iris. Bearded irises play a negligible role in the cut flower trade, so from the beginning, Ernst's aim was to produce plants that could be sold to gardeners. His plan was extremely ingenious. Not one, but two irises would be modified, a diploid and a tetraploid. Diploids are plants that have 2 sets of chromosomes. Tetraploids have 4 sets. This happens a lot with plants. It doesn't happen so much with animals. Neither plant would be released to the public, but they would be crossed to produce triploids, which have 3 sets of chromosomes, an uneven number that results in sterility. Only these sterile red irises would be sold to gardeners. Breeding opportunities would not end with crosses between the transformed diploid and the transformed tetraploid. The diploid would be crossed with unengineered diploids and the tetraploid with unengineered tetraploids to produce an unending succession of new red or red-producing parents. None of these would likely be released to the public, but a well-planned breeding program using them could theoretically yield an unending stream of sterile triploid irises in shades of red, salmon, and rose. These colors might appear as patterns or blended with other colors or be selves. That is, the entire flower would be those colors. Turn off the... So, such was the plan. However, as with blue roses, there were problems. It took 3 years to find out how to regenerate iris plants from single cells. An additional 2 years passed finding out how to insert a marker gene into the iris cells so that genetic transfers could be easily detected. Following this, genes from the coral lily, the tiger lily, and red pepper were transferred into iris cells. Additional genetic material intended to concentrate pigment was added from bacteria. As of 2005, the Red Iris project had cost $800,000. In 2006, Ernst predicted that even if $1 million was spent, the closest approach to spectrum red might be a pinker pink. The last I heard, there was no red iris. Whether or not red irises and blue roses are achieved anytime soon, the problems and costs of these projects may dampen the enthusiasm of investors in the future. Gardenia-scented blue dahlias will have to wait unless genetic engineering becomes far more versatile and inexpensive than it is today. It is becoming less expensive, but it's still enormously expensive to even change the color of a flower. Now, I've gone over these two projects, the blue rose and the red iris, in some detail. If you felt your eyes glazing over, I'm not surprised. The reality of genetic engineering is that it is technically exacting work that can be quite tedious to do and to recount. Even something as seemingly trivial as a new flower color can be very difficult to achieve. Several bioartists have celebrated the failed promises of biotechnology. For example, Kurtz and Untitled, two Australian artists, did a work called Pig Wings that consists of little lumps of cultured tissue with pathetic wing-like appendages. The point of the work is that just because we have genetic engineering, pigs won't fly anytime soon. Hope springs eternal anyway. Freeman Dyson, a physicist at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, here's Princeton again, but best known to the public for his predictions about technologies to come, believes that in the next 50 years, biotechnology will become so inexpensive and accessible that it will affect daily life as much as computers do today. Do-it-yourself genetic engineering kits will become widely available. Not only professionals, but, this is a quote, housewives and children will give us an explosion of diversity, close quote. For the sake of discussion, let's assume that Dyson is right. He's right about a lot of things. Imagine that everyone here, and everyone you know, and everyone you don't know, having the capacity to play around with the genomes of plants and animals. This could boggle our minds. So I'm going to narrow speculation to something manageable. What kinds of ornamental plants might we have good reason to expect if such a thing comes to happen? Certainly there would be plants like the blue rose and the red iris, long imagined, long sought, but difficult or impossible to achieve through traditional breeding. Gardeners have very long lists of such plants: hardy jacarandas, peonies that bloom from spring to fall, alkaline-loving rhododendrons, drought-resistant fuchsias, geraniums with golden yellow flowers, blue lilies, on and on. You can make your own list. Such plants would be very welcome additions to many gardens. However, they would not fundamentally change gardening or our sense of what plants be or can do. Luminescent plants, however, would change gardening. Genuinely new kinds of beauty and strangeness would result. Luminescent plants would also produce new kinds and qualities of social spaces. There might be, for example, houseplants that became night lights. There could be night gardens or night parks. There's a Spanish architectural firm that has explored the possibility of genetically engineering lemon trees to be luminescent that could serve as street lighting. And of course, we could have luminescent pumpkins for Halloween. The aesthetic quality of productions, whether from traditional wish lists or not, would depend on individual skill and taste, but especially on prevalent values, aesthetic and otherwise. The philosopher Georges Rey offers an explanation why certain arts achieve exceptional development in particular eras. Music during the Baroque, for example, or landscape painting during the Northern Sung Dynasty, or to come closer to home, cedar carving along the northwest coast during the late 19th and 20th centuries. These extraordinary flowerings of aesthetic excellence are, according to Rey, due to what he calls good cliches. Good cliches are given forms that are elegant, highly adaptable, and capable of conveying complex meanings. Good cliches help very ordinary artists, practitioners who we would not expect to engage fundamental questions of form, aesthetics, or meaning, to produce works of astonishing excellence. Sometimes such work by ordinary practitioners may continue to be widely appreciated long into the future. Of course, culture can also burden artists with bad cliches that condemn the work of even the most gifted practitioners to be quickly forgotten. If Georges Rey is right about aesthetic cliches, and I think he is, then we should ask, what kind of cliches prevail in plant breeding today? Keep in mind that genetic engineering borrows most of its aesthetic aims directly from traditional plant breeding. To answer the question, what cliches prevail in ornamental plant breeding, I want to look at how plant breeders make their selections. Plant selections involve two sets of concerns, horticultural and aesthetic. Horticultural concerns are straightforward. Breeders seek vigor, adaptability, and disease and pest resistance, all of which are quantifiable and few of which anyone is likely to question. Selection for aesthetic characteristics is another matter. Aesthetics involves qualities that can be difficult to assess and assign value. Artists, philosophers, and critics have developed ways of discussing and thinking about aesthetics, especially in connection with what we recognize as art. Most artists and designers learn the rudiments of aesthetic decision-making, or anti-aesthetic decision-making, which is really the same thing, in school. But plant breeders, with rare exceptions, work outside of these systems. No plant breeder has been trained by historians of ornamental plant breeding or learned from the judgment of a plant breeding critic, because those specialties do not exist. One might expect garden writing to foster awareness of the aesthetic issues in ornamental plant breeding, but this has not happened, with a few very rare exceptions, such as Sacheverell Sitwell's Old-Fashioned Flowers, which proclaimed that ornamental plant breeding is a fine art. Sitwell's book, which is completely forgotten today, was published 70 years ago. Typically, garden writers' remarks about relevant plant aesthetics are brief and vague. This is because garden writing has not evolved in service to plant breeding, but in service to landscape architecture and entertainment, with a little philosophizing thrown in. Okay, for thousands of years, people have selected plants for their aesthetic qualities, but not until the first half of the 19th century were attempts made to codify what that excellence was that they were selecting. The people who first did this were called florists. At the time, the meaning of the word florist was not what it is today. It was someone who grew flowers strictly for pleasure. In the 18th and early 19th century, in England, the florists were mostly weavers and other artisans. They lived in urban areas and grew flowers on small plots of land adjacent to their homes. 18th century artisans worked at home, so they were able to tend plants intermittently all through the day. This is hard to imagine today, but what was going on was that these people, who today would probably be watching football or basketball or playing cards, were devoting that same energy and time to their flower gardens. The florist's devotion and attentiveness helped produce some of the most remarkable plants ever grown. The florists who concern us here are those who, in addition to growing flowers for pleasure, attempted to create new kinds. We know very little about the methods that 18th century florists used to do what they called improve plants, but well before the discovery of plant sexuality, florists had made extremely sophisticated selections from open pollinated flowers. The kinds of plants that florists selected and bred had to meet very specific requirements. The flowers had to be showy and highly variable. The plants had to be relatively easy to grow and capable of reproducing both sexually and vegetatively. Sexual reproduction was necessary to produce new varieties, but vegetative reproduction was essentially so that new varieties could be propagated unaltered. In the 18th century, only 8 kinds of plants in cultivation met all of these requirements and received sustained attention from florists. The classic 8 were carnations, pinks, tulips, hyacinths, ranunculuses, anemones, polyanthuses, and auricula primulas. This is an auricula, and this is not an 18th century auricula, but it's like some of the ones that were bred in the 18th century. Extraordinarily sophisticated example of plant breeding. Gray and black. Who chooses gray and black flowers today? But wonderfully vivid and crisp. In the early 19th century, pansies and dahlias were added, and by mid-century, the list included hollyhocks, pelargoniums, calceolarias, roses, camellias, and fuchsias. The florists shared their creations at feasts. During the 18th century and into the first decades of the 19th, florist feasts were held in pubs and attended primarily by other florists. A lot of drinking was involved, sometimes so much that societies fell into disrepute and had to be disbanded. Public interest grew nevertheless, and eventually shows were moved to larger and more prestigious venues like halls and pavilions. Crowds turned out, and florist shows reached their zenith between 1830 and 1840 when even royalty attended. The prizes awarded to growers of winning flowers were modest, consisting of medals, utilitarian items such as copper kettles and silver spoons, or small cash awards. However, prestige can be a very powerful motivator, and as the shows grew larger, competition became more fierce. This put pressure on judges to justify their decisions. According to George Glennie, a landscape designer and horticultural writer of the time, the dilemma that florists and plant judges faced was, quote, "The definition of excellence is arbitrary," close quote. Each individual had his own preferences. In addition, different regions fostered different aesthetic goals. For example, tulip fanciers in the north of Britain were primarily concerned with the quality of markings, while fanciers in the south focused on shape and purity of color. Glennie grappled with such inconsistencies, and during the 1830s, he developed a system that provided what he considered to be unambiguous rules for judging florist flowers. Glennie produced lists of ideal properties, as he called them, for flowers. He insisted on formal patterning and geometric precision, circular silhouettes, and flowers shaped like spheres or portions of spheres. This ideal applied to all flowers, irrespective of biological origins. Whether judging a carnation or a rose, a fuchsia or a tulip, Glennie insisted that awards should go to flowers with petal edges that are smooth rather than serrated, and colors that are bright, clear, and distinct. This image has mostly ideal flowers, but on the bottom there, in the center, is a flawed petal. That's what you shouldn't breed for, according to Glennie. Here's a quote, for example, from Glennie's book. "Color, clear and distinct. Striped carnations should have color, clear and distinct, not running into one another, not confused, but dense, smooth at the edges of the stripes, and well defined. The colors must be bright and clear, whatever they may be. If there be two colors, the darker one cannot be too dark or form too strong a contrast with the lighter." This is an illustration from Glennie's book, and it shows some of these ideal flowers. And the one that I want you to pay particular attention to is the fuchsia, which is in the more or less upper left-hand corner. Fuchsias are do not lend themselves to being bred into circles or spheres, and yet that's what the breeders are being pressured to do. And we actually do have fuchsias today that are more or less spherical due to doubling and other manipulations of the petals. We still grow some of these flowers and enjoy them very much in our garden. This is a contemporary ball dahlia. Glennie's standards gained widespread acceptance because they afforded judges with seemingly objective criteria for evaluating aesthetic qualities. Also, many florists probably shared Glennie's vaguely Platonic ideals. But Glennie did more than bring order to flower judging. He aligned ornamental plant breeding with dominant forces of his time. The age demanded quantification and mastery of non-human nature. Progress involved the transformation of raw materials into goods. Glennie offered a model for the containment and taming of ornamental plants, as well as the containment of potentially disrupted disruptive aesthetic preferences. A few poets, artists, and scientists, and many of the victims of industrialism, resisted its notion of progress. But Glennie had the sensibility of neither an artist nor a scientist. He rejected, quote, the kinds of flowers that botanists delight in, flowers from a state of uncultivated nature, close quote. As he envisioned ornamental plant breeding, it would contribute to progress by realizing the ancient dream of perfecting nature and embellishing the realm of human control. Now, I've gone over this in some detail because it's still with us today. In the second half of the 19th century, new plant societies were organized in Europe and the United States. Organizations such as the British National Dahlia Society, established in 1876, and the American Rose Society, established in 1892, were modern in their essential features. Each had a broad national base of members linked together by railway systems. Each society focused on just one kind of plant. Members exchanged information on plant culture, breeding, and exhibition, as had the florists, but the new societies had greater resources than had the florists. These made possible specialists' publications and sponsorship of plant collecting expeditions, as well as of scientific research, much of it useful to hybridizers. Today in the US, there are separate national plant societies for many different kinds of ornamental plants. Each society determines its own standards of excellence, but all resemble one another. You can get the handbooks and compare them. All are descended from Glennie's system or strongly influenced by it. All attempt to balance horticultural and aesthetic considerations. Most systems require separate evaluation of different features of plants, which assures that no hybrid will win high awards for a single outstanding feature, color, say, or ideal form, if other qualities are lacking. Over the years, perfections have multiplied. Glennie recognized a single ideal form, the circle, or in the case of full doubles, the sphere or some portion of one. Among the many different kinds of dahlias, for example, Glennie valued only ball-like formal doubles, like this one, between 4 and 6 inches across. Today, dahlia growers can exhibit not only formal doubles that range in size from an inch across to more than a foot, but informal doubles, cactus flowered doubles, water lily flowered, orchid flowered, and singles, anemones, and collarettes. Each type has its own ideal characteristics. So let's look at one of these handbooks. The 2007 Handbook for Judges and Show Officials of the American Iris Society, that's the most recent handbook, shows how Glennie's system has been adapted to a flower that he did not consider worthy of attention. The handbook discusses 17 classes of irises and has guidelines for judging them both in the garden and on the show bench. The scale for garden judged introduced varieties of miniature tall bearded irises is typical. That's this one. Miniature tall irises are defined in the handbook as plants that are between 16 and 27.5 inches tall. I won't go through the whole definition. What's important is that the scale looks exact and authoritative, but it raises some obvious questions. How are the numbers assigned? For example, why 20 points for flower, color, and finish? Why not 10? Which garden judged border irises receive in the handbook? Or 15, like intermediate irises, or something else altogether? The handbook does not explain. Shouldn't fragrance be rewarded? After all, fragrance is one of the outstanding features of bearded irises. The handbook acknowledges this, but does not reward fragrance because it, quote, is subjective. What smells heavenly to one individual may be offensive to another. It's true enough. However, we can say much the same about every other aesthetic quality. If subjectivity disqualifies scent, shouldn't it also disqualify color and form? The handbook ignores this problem. All we learn is that color and tall bearded irises should shine, be brilliant, delicate, or rich, bright and pleasing, and should create harmony, but must never be drab or dull, rough, or strike a discordant note. To me, this sounds like advice for shopping mall decor. Why not strike a discordant note in plant breeding? Art is full of discords. As for the forms of tall bearded irises, rounded falls are highly regarded, but if the shape approaches a circular form, it should be ruffled. Narrow, rectangular, or strappy falls are not acceptable. That's a quote. Line drawings of heavily, this is a ruffled iris, the kind that would be awarded by the American Iris Society judges. Line drawings of heavily ruffled bearded irises reinforce the text. However, ruffles, as well as rounded horizontal falls, which the handbook also advocates, are not representative of bearded irises in the wild or of most irises that have been cultivated over the last 2,500 years. This is an iris from around 1900, before ruffles became necessary for winning awards. The handbook does not say why such unrepresented forms are desirable. Their superiority is taken to be self-evident. Opinion in Europe is sufficiently divided that some breeders there have felt compelled to defend ruffles. The late Dr. Peter Werkmeister, a German iris breeder and expert, believed that, quote, present-day irises are more beautiful than anything before, close quote. He considered ruffling a key element of this beauty because wavy flower forms bring to mind, quote, the sturdiness of corrugated iron. He admitted that this comparison may be a bit shocking, yet he called it indisputably right because one aim of plant breeding is to overcome the fragile appearances of flowers, which reminded him, and should remind everyone else, he implied, of death. He went on to say that falls should be bred horizontal because vertical falls look crestfallen and point downward towards the earth and death. From the evidence of sales, many American gardeners agree with Dr. Werkmeister that the present-day irises are more appealing than the tailored sorts that prevailed before the mid-20th century. However, I doubt that many Americans see corrugated iron in wavy flower parts or death in vertical falls. What do ruffles express to us? Other fluffy things, I expect, like Barbie's flounces or Las Vegas. Life, these extravaganzas suggest, is here for our entertainment. It is something for us to buy, enjoy, and then abandon. The handbook's aesthetic values are as unerringly aligned with dominant social forces today as Glennie's system was with the British Industrial Revolution. Industrial growth society no longer sustains untarnished utopian dreams, much less credible metaphysical ideals. So Glennie's system, in its original form, no longer serves us. But in its modified form, it does. Our system is overreached. And among the likely futures, if we can believe leading biologists and climatologists, are wrenching change, collapse, or even human extinction. But in the face of signs and evidence, consumer society continues to do what it has always done best, as we know. Today's standards of excellence in ornamental plants serve the machineries of diversion. Turn off the slide projector. The problem for all national plant societies today is that Glennie's system, in spite of its extension modifications, is completely antiquated. These awards, by the way, do have effects on our gardens because awarded plants make their way into nurseries, and they make their way from nurseries into gardens and also institutional plantings. Guidelines more suited to preserving the world we live in will require building on what we know about ecology and aesthetics and acceptance of what ornamental plant breeding in fact is, a long-term experiment in applying human consciousness to evolution. This experiment, that is ornamental plant breeding, I am convinced is more important than may meet the eye. Except for biotech art, highly bred ornamental plants represent the only human intervention in evolution that is not circumscribed by practical necessities, scientific imperatives, or urgent ethical concerns. With ornamental plants, experimentation can be relatively free. Exercise of that freedom may have much to tell us about the possibilities and dangers that we face as we bring greater consciousness to evolution. Freeman Dyson's vision of housewives and children democratically producing new organisms suggests a future very much like the present. The only difference will be that there will be all sorts of new toys. Margaret Atwood, I think, is a much less sentimental guide to the biotechnological future. She's written two of the best novels about biotechnology, Oryx and Crake, which was published in 2003, and The Year of the Flood, which just came out last month. There will be a third. It's a part of a trilogy. Both novels describe a world like our own, but more so. Corporations rule the earth, societies divided into haves who live in gated communities with excellent shopping, and the have-nots who inhabited vast crime-ridden slums. Slow motion ecological collapse is in full swing. Biotechnology speeds catastrophe along, but offers lots of fun. There are all sorts of new pets, like rakunks, which are cuddly skunk raccoon splices, and glowing green rabbits. That's Atwood's nod to Eduardo Kurtz. There's also a rich array of genetic kitsch, including caterpillars with smiley face masks. And these larvae were engineered as biological controls for kudzu, but escaped and eventually devoured everything they could reach. The adult butterfly, by the way, is hot pink. As for the democratization of biotechnology, the more notable results are new organisms created by religious fanatics to fulfill biblical prophecies. Atwood is such a good writer that her most dire warnings are a lot more fun to read than Dyson's sunny prophecies. We can imagine alternatives to the course we seem to be on, beginning with modest, apparently irrelevant things like flower gardens. National plant societies could use art curatorship as a model for issuing awards, or societies could develop new written standards in tune with what we know about ecology and aesthetics. For example, standards of excellence could be developed that take Aldo Leopold's famous axiom as a starting point. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. Our interventions in evolution in the garden could benefit, I think, from recognition that aesthetic excellence cannot be determined once and for all by votes or sales, that it is not synonymous with beauty or technical skill or uniqueness or wide adaptability. It also helps to take Darwin seriously. He tells us that we are part of nature. This means that our works are also parts of nature. Among our works are domesticated plants. Even the most highly bred are parts of nature. Wildness, I think we can all agree, can be aesthetically excellent, but all excellence is not wild, and wild gardens are not enough. Thoreau is a good start, but not enough. Ornamental plant breeding, as I've already said, but it bears repeating, is a long-term experiment in bringing human consciousness to evolution. This implies that the more genetic and aesthetic experiments, the better. Experimentation should be rewarded. Most experiments will fail, but we need failure as much as we need success. Ornamental plants are not innocent things, at least not innocent in the Disneyland sense. Partly because plants are not falsely innocent, they are for many of us a vital link to the greater community of life, a way of getting beyond the parochialism of the human world. The city is a very parochial thing. We can be sure that ornamental plants will continue to help us in the world in the decades and centuries to come. Whatever ways humans change plants, I hope that these changes will, on the whole, bring us what I believe plants almost certainly brought our ancestors as far back as the savannah. Inhuman beauty and strangeness, slowness, affirmation of our connection with the rest of life, and silence. The rest is glitz. Thank you.